A new report by the international NGO Human Rights Watch, which says that the Israeli military's use of lethal force against Palestinians on the Gaza border over the past 2.5 months, and that resulted in over 100 deaths, may amount to war crimes. HRW says the Palestinians killed pose no imminent threat to life. The Israeli military says it's acted to prevent infiltrations by militants intending to attack its civilians. Well, joining us from New York is Louis Charbonneau, the United Nations director at Human Rights Watch. And Louis, briefly, give us the case that HRW is making of potential war crimes, as you charge, there at the Gaza border.
Thanks for having me. Basically, you laid out the case right there. What we're saying is that the demonstrators did not pose an imminent threat to the life of Israelis. Israel has every right to protect its territory, and the use of deadly fire in a demonstration situation is only permissible under international law, international legal standards that Israel accepts, if there is an imminent threat to life. This was not the case here. People were fired on, killed. As you said, over 100 were killed. There have been nearly 4,000 injuries. This may amount to a war crime. The individuals who gave the orders to use deadly fire, to use live ammunition, should be identified in the UN inquiry that's been set up. And then we'd like to see third-party countries actually impose individual sanctions on the Israeli officials who are responsible for those orders, because we can't rely on the Security Council, given that the United States has been vetoing anything that would condemn or criticize Israel over Gaza.
Louis, I want to ask you to widen the scope for a moment. After one of the first rounds of protests, this is about the 10th week running, Hamas, a group that runs the Gaza Strip, a group that both Israel and the United States consider a terrorist organization, admitted in broad daylight on TV that at least 50 of 100 killed on a particular day were Hamas militants. What does that tell you about the makeup of those protests and how they're being driven?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct that Hamas was encouraging these protests. They normally kept people away from the fences, but in the course of the protests were actually encouraging people to go up to the fences. There were buses bringing people there. But there were a lot of people who went there not because Hamas encouraged them, according to people that we've spoken to, but just because someone is a member of Hamas doesn't mean that they can be shot dead. And protesting, or someone who's being encouraged by Hamas to go protest. That shouldn't be, that's not grounds for being killed, right? It's not grounds for a summary execution. If a group of convicts, if I could just finish, if a group of ex-convicts in New York City here were to organize a demonstration, the police would not be allowed to use live ammunition against them if they were pushing against the barricade unless there was an imminent threat to life.
I wanted to say that your own report cites an example where there was live fire by some of the demonstrators on Israeli troops there at the border. The crux of the Israeli argument is that any one of those protesters who breaks through the fence can potentially pose an imminent threat. They could be wearing a suicide bomber vest. They could have a knife. Who's to make that judgment? The soldiers whose lives are at stake, or you sitting there in New York?
Well, for one thing, the distance between the Israeli soldiers and the demonstrators was usually, we're talking in the hundreds of meters, and in some cases there were people closer to the fence. Now, that does not mean imminent threat to life. And also, there are other things that can be used. Rubber-coated steel pellets, water cannons, skunk water. These are things that are often used in crowd control situations where you have a demonstration where you're worried that the situation could get out of control. These things weren't being used, right? They were the level of Israeli violence in dealing with the demonstrations. They turned the volume up to 10 right away.
Louis,
there are there are intermediate measures that one can use. These were not used. They went straight to live ammunition.
So let's bring in, Louis.
This may be a war crime.
So let's bring in another perspective here. I want to sort of read you, cite some of the stuff that was said by Brigadier General Ronen Manelis from the Israeli military in the Wall Street Journal during these protests. He said that Hamas actually hired people as sort of extras, paying them $14 a person or $100 a family for attendance and $500 if they managed to get injured. That is not a sort of a crazy statement given the way that Hamas is known to behave in general. Is that something that Human Rights Watch is investigating as well in this report?
We're looking at all sides in here, but certainly I would say if this is true, if someone's getting paid to go try and breach the fence, that's still not grounds for a summary execution. And it's something that Israel has every right to protect its fence, but there are measures far short of shooting someone dead. Or
that I understood. I'm just wondering
injuries that we've seen.
That is 100% legitimate. I'm just wondering how much is the other side, that is Hamas's role in those protests, what they're actually asking of Palestinian civilians whose lives matter a whole lot, what they are asking them to do, how much that is being investigated in this report.
Well, first of all, Hamas encouraging people to protest. There's nothing wrong with protesting.
I'm asking, though, about paying them $500.
Countries, we all know that. So that's not an issue that we aren't investigating Hamas for liking the fact that people are protesting. Now, we have done quite a bit of research on Hamas and on the human rights abuses that they're involved in. You can be arrested and tortured simply for criticizing the Hamas rulers in Gaza, and this is something that we have documented. We're not saying that Hamas is a choir of angels here by any means. We are looking at all sides, but we're talking in this specific instance of the use of deadly fire where there was no imminent threat.
Well, you keep saying there was no imminent threat. Your own report cites live fire from those demonstrators on the border. We just saw pictures. It's a smoky situation. There are members of a terrorist group, and the United States recognizes it. Israel says in this case its soldiers are in danger.
Well, certainly there were Molotov cocktails used. People were flying kites with incendiary attachments over Israeli territory. Rocks were being thrown. And there was an instance where there was some weapons fire. But this is not the imminent threat to life that justifies the use of deadly force in the way that we've seen used in recent months on the border of Gaza and Israel.
Louis,
it's just not.
Louis Charbonneau, unfortunately, we have to wrap here, go out for commercial. Louis Charbonneau, United Nations Director at Human Rights Watch.